Good morning, afternoon, or evening, folks, and welcome to Cast of All Trades. I'm your host, Orion Siebert, and in this episode, I explore the world of interdisciplinary thinking. What does it mean to be an interdisciplinary thinker? Why did this form of thinking lose popularity over the years? How can you develop interdisciplinary thinking for yourself? The more you look into it, the more you start to realize that our world would be a very different place if we didn't have interdisciplinary thinkers in it. So come along with me and learn how to expand your mind, become an idea-connecting machine, benefits that come along with developing an interdisciplinary mind, and much more. I'm happy to say that I've got some wonderful guests coming on in the next few weeks. One such guest is a leadership expert, and we're going deep into destructive leaders and how to fight back against them. If that sounds interesting to you, then subscribe to the show so you don't miss out on that episode and other intriguing interviews coming soon. And with all that said, and without further ado, welcome to the world of interdisciplinary thinking. So first things first, what is interdisciplinary thinking? And you could probably figure it out just based on the word alone, but interdisciplinary thinking is being able to take ideas from many different subjects, from many different disciplines, and bring them together to solve problems, to come up with new ideas, to generally it's the process of connecting ideas from across many different disciplines. So who are some famous interdisciplinary thinkers that you might know of? I'm going to list three here for you. First is Isaac Asimov, and you would probably best know him for Asimov's 3 Laws of Robotics, but he originally started off as a biochemist and writer, so he blended those things together, and that's what allowed him to become such a prolific sci-fi author. And because of his works, sci-fi became much more approachable to the average person. And similarly, they were able to bring more science into the world of sci-fi that made sense and actually worked out somewhat in real life, or was grounded at least in some real scientific principles. So Isaac Asimov, first great interdisciplinary thinker. Second is Madame Curie, a wonderful, wonderful woman who was probably the definition of a true scientist of her day. Marie Curie was known in physics, in chemistry, in radiation science, and in studying medicine. She was able to bring all these disciplines together to not earn just 1, but 2 Nobel Prizes, and go on to use her work in physics and radiation to set the groundwork for many different types of medicine to come. So truly, she was a specialist among interdisciplinary thinkers, where she went deep across a wide range of scientific topics, but was able to bring them together, as opposed to Isaac Asimov, who went deep into biochemistry in one side of science, and went deep into one side of writing and brought those two things together. So already you're starting to see that there's different ways to do interdisciplinary thinking. It's not just a one-size-fits-all sort of thing. And finally, last but certainly not least, probably the king of interdisciplinary thinkers is Leonardo da Vinci, where he was a well-renowned artist, engineer, he knew anatomy like no one else did, and he was an all-around scientist. And by bringing together all these different disciplines, he was able to expand and develop each of the fields that he interacted with by connecting ideas from each. For example, in the art world, he was able to create people, renditions of people, far better than anyone else was because he understood anatomy, and through his art, he was also able to create far better sketches for engineering, for science, for discovering the world around him, and that pushed forward so much of the sciences and discovery of the natural world and engineering by being able to connect all these ideas together. Many of his ideas were far ahead of their time, but would in the future go on to lay the groundwork for many crucial inventions that run our world today. So truly, if you want a good example of an interdisciplinary thinker, Leonardo da Vinci is probably the king of them, connecting ideas from all sorts of different areas of life to build on top of one another, to create something new, something better. So you've seen 3 different kinds of interdisciplinary thinkers, but what are some more direct examples of it? One such example is something that you may or may not have heard of, called soft robotics, where this is a newer type of robotics where it essentially links the ideas of origami, the folding of paper to make interesting designs, kirigami, cutting paper to make interesting designs, such as if you were a kindergartner folding a piece of paper and then cutting a snowflake out of it, that's what kirigami is. blending those two, material science, engineering, math, and so much more. And what is so different about this form of soft robotics is that when you think of traditional robotics, typically people will think hard, rigid, like very like not forgivable, perhaps is a good way to put it, where these robots, like, they're very ornate, very intricate, have a lot of small moving pieces to them, and there's something to them that it makes it very difficult to mimic life, and that's exactly what soft robotics does quite well. These robots are far better at mimicking living creatures and organic structures than basically any form of traditional robotics, or hard robotics as I'm probably going to call it now. And by doing this, you're able to create, say, like synthetic wings or different kinds of synthetic skins. Or one good example that I'm just remembering now is perhaps it's not soft robotics per se, but it's along the same lines where as NASA put a lot of research and development into origami and material science and electrical engineering and energy sciences to create different kinds of solar panels that could fold up into different shapes through study of origami to make a much more compact and much more energy efficient or energy dense style of solar panels they could put on different satellites or put on Mars rovers or just put out into space in general. So that's another good example of interdisciplinary thinking, bringing origami and engineering into one to create far better solar panels. Another good example of this is looking at actually many of the great advancements in the medical industry, where a good example of this would be the development of heart surgery, where this is only able to happen thanks to physicians working with engineers and people of other specialties and other disciplines developing the technology to allow doctors to try new surgeries. In order for them to even attempt doing heart surgery on people, they had to create the heart-lung machine to be able to temporarily take the place of a patient's heart and lungs, so doctors could go in, work on the heart, work on the lungs, and then put the person back together, and off you go. That's only possible thanks to interdisciplinary thinkers coming in and saying, okay, this is a problem that you're having. You're not going to be able to solve this with your thing alone, with your one discipline alone. We need to bring in other people with other specialties, connect our knowledge, connect our information to say, what do you know that helps here? What do you know that helps here? What do you know that helps here? By stacking these different skills on top of each other, we're able to create amazing leaps in technology and advancement and solve more intricate problems than you could with one discipline alone. So if I'm hyping it up so much, why is it less prevalent today than ever before? Perhaps less prevalent on an individual level, maybe not less prevalent on a group or societal level, where you have many specialists working together to try to solve problems, like many individual specialists working with other specialists of different disciplines. So it's less of interdisciplinary thinking, but more interdisciplinary work in general, where you have individual specialists of different disciplines working together to try to solve problems. But why do we discourage interdisciplinary thinking, or why is it less prevalent today in the individual? And I have my own theories for this. I haven't looked too much into other people's theories and other ideas, but this is so far what I think happened. And I'm going back to early university, when universities just started coming around. Early universities, they're far different from today's modern universities in a couple different ways. One such way is that everyone took every single class in the university, no exceptions. You go to the university, you learn a wide array of different skills. You went to science class, you learned chemistry, you learned physics, you learned anatomy, you learned math, you learned writing, you learned philosophy, you learned communication, you learned everything. Every single class in the school, you would take all of them. And the goal wasn't to create specialists. The goal was to create the universal man, or to create someone who could go back out into society and accomplish great things and do more. They could be someone that can fit into any situation. That was originally the goal of universities, to teach people to expand minds, to increase knowledge across all disciplines. But of course, as we've developed technology and developed knowledge and increased in both greater and greater and greater, universities, well, let's put it this way. If I were to currently try to take every single class at my university, I would probably be spending upwards of 10 to 20 years here trying to take every single class, or probably even more. There's probably a lifetime worth of classes at universities now. So thinking about that, it logically makes sense why we cut back on creating the universal man, or developing like more well-rounded people. Now we just have generals to do that, and I know for the longest time I complained about doing generals in college, thinking to myself, oh, I'm never going to use this. I want to be an XYZ specialist in this one thing. Why do I have to learn how to do writing, or why do I have to learn how to do public speaking, or yada yada yada? But it's it's an interesting vestige of the older university system, where we can still develop some level of interdisciplinary thinking, even though, in reality, many of us go to university for one specific skill, for one specific thing, to become a specialist at doing one thing. Hence why we have so many different degrees now, where you can go to school, you can get a biotechnology and genetic engineering degree, you can get a mechanical engineering degree, you can get a business degree, you can get a business marketing degree, you can go in and get a underwater basket weaving degree if you so wished, probably at some universities. So, as time had gone on, we have changed from the original university system of trying to create the universal man to the modern university system, where we're trying to create cogs, where it's finding individual people to become machines to fit into the greater machine of like the world economic system that says we need a specific cog to fit in this spot, and that specific cog needs to be fit by a specialist that does XYZ specific jobs. So that's sort of my theories on why we've gone from a universal man, interdisciplinary thinking styled world and education system to a more specialist focused, go down, learn this one thing, become a master, quote unquote master, since let's be honest, today most people who graduate from college are not masters at their skills. A lot of them probably aren't even that great at it, but quote unquote masters at specific skills. And another reason I think that we might have less prevalent interdisciplinary thinking today is sort of stacking on top of that, where this idea of a specialist university system isn't necessarily new, but it's not necessarily old either. And we've already had a number of people go through the university system, work their way up in corporate structures, and integrate themselves inside businesses and inside organizations. And as people get older, they experience a process called brain calcification, where essentially their brains become incapable, or they become far more resistant to adapting to new things, to trying out new things, and saying, well, a lot of them will often have pride or other things that say, I've been here the longest, I know what's best, you're going to listen to me, you're not, like, I'm the specialist here, therefore I'm in charge. And there's going to be a lot of pushback to people approaching them saying, I have a new idea that brings in some information from this other discipline that seems unrelated, but trust me, it helps out here. So that's another reason for it, that I guess sort of explaining that in a simpler terms, it's the nail that sticks out that gets hammered, i.e. it's the person who tries to bring in new ideas, who tries to shake things up, that tries to change culture or tries to solve a problem in a different way, that gets beat down, that says, well, that gets told, no, you don't get to do that because I'm in charge here, I know what's best. So that's sort of my theories on why we don't have interdisciplinary thinking as much today, where sure, we get a limited exposure to it through college generals or through some high school classes, kind of. But really, if you want to be an interdisciplinary thinker, it's something you have to go out and actively try to do. So, going into that, what are some things that we can do to encourage people to be interdisciplinary thinkers? And better yet, let's look at both the pros and the cons, because there are certainly many pros to it, but there are also some cons that we should probably look at. There's no perfectly good, 100% perfect thing about anything. So, looking into some pros of interdisciplinary thinking, what are some things that we should look at? So, one is that being an interdisciplinary thinker typically means that you have an increased rate of innovation and creativity. And I touched on this a little bit with some of the examples earlier, but essentially, by being an interdisciplinary thinker, you have access to a wider range of knowledge, to a wider tree of knowledge that says, I have a couple main branches that I have key knowledge in. Say I'm a specialist in like musical instruments and playing piano, and in engineering, and in, I don't know, it's hard to think of some of these things off the top of my head. Let's stick with just two for now, of musical instruments and engineering. I guess let's add physics in there as well. By having these different sets of knowledge, you're able to try to bring ideas from one place to another and make connections far easier than you would if you just have one discipline that you're hyper-focused in. So, and typically by bringing these different ideas together, you're going to see some new ideas that maybe no one else at the organization or in your company that has introduced yet, just because you have a unique set of skills that says, okay, I'm good at doing this piano thing, I'm good at doing this performance thing, I'm good at doing this engineering thing. What if I brought some of these interesting principles together to say, oh yeah, the vibration of the strings in the piano, that reminds me of this engineering project that we're working on currently. What if I were to take some principles from building pianos and apply that to this engineering project we're working on? Congratulations, you've just used interdisciplinary thinking to try to solve a problem in a different way, or to increase innovation and creativity. So that's one example. Second pro that I want to touch on is leapfrog innovations. And this is one that I also touched on earlier a bit with medical advancements, where we probably would not be able to do like heart surgery, or it would have taken much, much longer to develop heart surgery and many different types of surgery if we did not have people outside the medical field stepping into it with their expertise, saying, I have some different expertise, I have a different set of knowledge that says, I think I can help out these doctors do their thing better. By bringing different ideas together, you're able to make leapfrog innovations, where you go from like step-by-step, slow incrementations of getting better and better and better at something. Instead, you can say, oh, by introducing this new idea from a different field, we can go from level 5 to level 10 in one leap. And that's exactly what happened with surgery and heart surgery. By being able to introduce engineers and people with other specialties into the medical field to say, okay, this is the problem that we're having, can you help us solve it? They're able to create machines that mimic how hearts beat, how lungs work, and be able to essentially recreate the heart-lung and create the heart-lung machine, thus a leapfrog innovation in medical science. That's another pro of being interdisciplinary thinkers, or by bringing a bunch of people of different disciplines together to solve a problem. But you can theoretically also do that all in one person's head if they have the right sets of knowledge. So the third pro is having a wider view of problem solving, both in the sense of being able to get a wider view of how you can solve a certain problem, but also getting a better view of how your solution can solve other people's problems. And a good way for me to look at this is looking at it from the lens of one big problem that the world is facing currently is the global decline in birth rates, where this is inevitably going to lead to maybe not like societal collapse or population collapse, but it will lead to a decline in population, which will affect GDP, which will affect many aspects of life, where typically how the system worked before is the more people will give birth to more kids. As these kids grow up, they'll get taxed. Their tax dollars will go to funding and paying for the retirement and good life of the older generation. The younger generation takes care of them, yada, yada, yada. That generation eventually grows up. They have kids of their own, hopefully more kids, so that that cycle can keep going. But if you have fewer kids in the generation below you, that means you have to tax them even more, and it's going to be harder on these people to work to make money for themselves, to try to build up their own lives. Thus, they're not going to want to have kids of their own because kids are expensive to raise. So, continuing off of that, as this generation grows up and grows old, the generation below them is going to have an even harder time because there are fewer people born, and this eventually devolves into a sort of a population death spiral, as some people call it. So the idea of population collapse, that's a big problem that people are looking at. And they're saying, okay, what can we do about this? And people are typically looking at it from the lens of a political side of things, where how can politics go into encouraging people to have more kids, to essentially prevent population to collapse, where we can at least keep a population minimum, where we have a 2.1% replacement rate, yada, yada, yada. We've been looking at it mostly from a lens of a political lens and an economic lens of how can we solve these problems and how can we solve the implications leading up afterwards of, say, the economic collapse resulting from not having enough people to take the jobs of people who are retiring. That's where we look at other disciplines to see what are some solutions that we have coming up from outside the world of economics and politics. And there are two big technologies that I would look at to say that could solve the problem without having to do anything with economics or politics, even though it will. Those two technologies would be advancements in AI and advancements in lifespan healthcare, biological healthcare, longevity escape velocity technology is probably the best way to put it. So first, with AI, if we develop AI and robotics to a suitable point, then we can replace people's jobs with artificial intelligence and AI, well, with artificial intelligence and robotics, to say, well, we didn't have enough people to hire anyways to fill this position, so we're just going to put a robot there anyways that's going to work better, faster, cheaper, safer than a normal person would anyways. So from the economic standpoint, that should be taken care of. And from a biological standpoint of we're running out of people, as we continue to develop longevity, escape velocity-based technologies and healthcare practices, then that shouldn't technically matter if we get to the point where humanity can, in theory, live for hundreds of thousands of years, in theory, forever, or yeah. So by developing these technologies that are totally unrelated to the problems spawned from a collapsing or declining population, you can see that by implementing ideas from outside your sphere of expertise, they can quickly and often solve your problems better than if you try to solve the problems from within your expertise. So yeah, that's just a better example of how a wider worldview of interdisciplinary thinking can help with problem solving, not just solving your own problems, but solving other people's problems with your own solutions. So that sort of blends well into the next step of part 4, greater world understanding and potential tech/solutions. I guess I've sort of answered both of that, where with the wider viewpoint of problem solving, you're able to look out into the world to say, okay, these things can help solve my problem, and then the greater world understanding and potential tech/solutions is looking at your solutions and finding problems that they can also go out and fix. So I guess that was sort of a double whammy that I fit together. Okay, the fifth pro that I want to talk about is being more adaptable, where if you have just one specialty that you're really good at and kind of meh at everything else, imagine what happens when that skill that you become so good at just becomes obsolete, because it's inevitable that things will become obsolete. People thought for a long time that, oh, the horse and buggy is the best way to get around. There is nothing better than this. If we want to move faster, then we just got to breed faster horses. Yeah, and then we get Henry Ford creating the automobile, where great, instantly the horse and cart becomes obsolete, where people go from like trying to breed horses to be faster and faster to instead just getting engineers to design better and better cars. So people who bred horses for a living, who raised horses, who made horse and buggy carriages, said, oh, well, I'm kind of out of a job now, or at least the demand for my skill set has gone down drastically. Where, sure, even today we still have some horse and buggy users, some people who breed horses just for this situation. But for the most part, that's either people who are Amish or people who are in the tourism industry who want to make a quick buck. To say, oh yeah, we can have a tourist thing where we have people getting pulled around by a horse and cart. So there you go. But if you have many skills, or are willing to be more adaptable through interdisciplinary thinking by saying, maybe this one skill that I have is obsolete, but I have a number of other skills and I have information from a bunch of other areas that still make it more applicable, where I can say, maybe this individual skill or this knowledge that I've acquired is obsolete here, but I can take it and apply it to other areas that I'm also an expert at or very good at, to say, maybe this information isn't totally useless now. I can still use it in other areas, and other areas of information can still be used in this place that was technically obsolete if I knew just this one skill. Essentially, it means that as things develop and as technology continues to improve, to say AI and robotics eventually taking over basically every single job that we could ever want, then we can still say, if you want a job, then congratulations, you still have more. By being an interdisciplinary thinker, you are more adaptable and better able to fit into a majority of situations. And sort of building on that is pro number 6, better at cross-collaborative work, where if you are the interdisciplinary thinker of a group of experts that are trying to work together, by being the guy that understands the terminology across a wide range of topics and trying to bring people together, it makes you probably the middleman between everyone else to say, okay, you Orion, understand that will understand the terminology and knowledge of expert field A and expert field B, and we have to work together to try to solve this problem. Congratulations, you're able to better communicate and probably help them solve the problem much faster and much better if they were to try to work alone without some interdisciplinary thinker there that understands both parties. So, yeah. And 7, this is one that I wasn't sure if I wanted to include or not, but it's kind of a fun one that I wanted to talk a bit more about. And the 7th pro is actually interdisciplinary thinkers tend to be better at predicting the future. And this is an interesting one for me. And there's some interesting studies going into this, but a lot of people think when you're trying to predict the future, such as the economic future or the political future or yada, 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 just different kinds of futures, that you want a specialist in that field to tell you about what's going on and what they think is going to happen in the future. But surprisingly, that's wrong, where if you want to look into this, there's an interesting study. I'm pretty sure it's called the Good Judgment Project. It was super big, funded by the CIA. It's all about the idea of super forecasting or trying to predict the future. And what we learned from it is that the more that people who know a little about a lot can go and predict the future far better than people who know a lot about a little. Typically, the idea behind that is that people who know a lot about a little are always trying to pound like a square peg into a round hole, where they have the golden hammer that hits everything, where they say, this is what my expertise is in, therefore I'm going to apply that to literally everything as I try to predict the future. Whereas if you know a little about a lot, then you have a wider range of knowledge and a wider array of places that you can connect ideas from to say, okay, I don't know this, I don't recognize this particular situation from the standpoint of this topic, but it sounds very similar to a couple different areas that have happened previously or have happened before. I can say, based on what's happened before in these other areas, perhaps we'll get this kind of outcome. So yeah, typically those who are interdisciplinary thinkers who know maybe not a little about a lot, but know a decent amount about a decent amount of things, typically are better at predicting the future. So just more that you know. Of course, not everything is sunshine and rainbows when it comes to anything. So what are some of the cons to interdisciplinary thinking? One is that career-wise, it can be far more difficult to start a career. That said, long-term, typically from what we've seen, that is that generalists and jack-of-all-trades are actually able to gain and earn more in the long term. But yeah, starting your career, that can be very difficult. Being someone who's an expert in many areas, a lot of companies and a lot of organizations don't like that. They want to say, great, we want to hire you for one thing and one thing only. So get good at doing that one thing. That said, as you move up in a career and as you move up in an organization, if you're able to take and work with a bunch of different areas, that makes you indispensable to that organization. So starting off is difficult, but working your way up and long-term, being an interdisciplinary thinker is probably a benefit, but I'm still putting it in a con because if you can't get started, you're never going to get to that end point. Second is that you could be seen as less than compared to the specialists, where I've talked about this a little bit more in my theories of why interdisciplinary thinking is less prevalent today, but it's sort of going along that same lines, and I'm going to blend this in with number 3 of resistance from specialists, where if you are the guy that knows like a bunch about a bunch of different topics, people are going to see you and say, oh, like, sure, you know a lot, like you are a fountain of useless knowledge, is probably what a lot of them will think, where they might say, okay, you are working this job here, or you're doing this thing, but you are less than I am because I am a total specialist in this thing. I have you see this a lot in the academic field actually, where if people will pride themselves on being an expert on one very niche piece of knowledge, which sure, good for them, but is that actually very helpful when you're talking to other people about other things? So yeah. And resistance from specialists, once again, it comes back to that idea of people are resistant to change. They're resistant to new ideas. People don't like things changing or changing out of their control. So by being someone who is an interdisciplinary thinker and able to bring in other ideas from other places, that can threaten their idea of this is how things are supposed to work. So yeah. The fourth con that I want to touch on is there's a higher potential for superficial understanding, where this is important for me to touch on, and it's going back to that idea of you don't actually want to know a little about a lot. You want to know enough about a couple things, where the best way I can really describe interdisciplinary thinking is that it's not trying to learn absolutely everything about everything, or trying to learn a little about everything. I'm pretty sure this is called the Dunning-Kruger effect, where people who are starting off something, they make a bit of progress, or they learn a bit about something, they say, oh yeah, I'm an expert at this thing now, even though they really know nothing. But there's a higher potential for that if you are being an interdisciplinary thinker and actively trying to learn new things. But that can put you in some tight places. But overall, if you push past that phase and are actually able to find a couple different areas that you say, this is what I'm going to learn about, then it's less of a con and less of a problem. So, and finally, number 5 is that it can be kind of difficult to implement being an interdisciplinary thinker in our modern day. As I've already touched on, it's kind of fallen out of favor in many areas where people always want you to specialize. They say, you better become a specialist or you better become an expert at one thing, because if you become an expert at a bunch of things, we don't know what to do with you. So yeah, it can be kind of difficult to implement since you have to actively go out of your way to try to develop it. And speaking of going out of your way to try to develop it, how can you do that? So I have a number of different ideas that you can try to help develop interdisciplinary thinking in your life. But first things first is that you got to pick a few topics you want to learn more about and be open to learning other things, of course. But pick the few things that you think, yeah, this is either going to be interesting to me, this is going to be useful to me, or just a bunch of stuff. I like to try to find, I don't have a specific number here, but it's essentially just trying to choose a few things that you say to yourself, I want to learn this thing, I think it's going to be useful, I'm just curious about it. It's just going into this with the idea of being curious and actively going out and trying to find new information. Just be open to whatever you find. So that's step 1. So going from here, what do you do about it? What do you do to try to develop more interdisciplinary thought? First is to diversify your media consumption, to forcibly expose you to new ideas. Specifically, a good example of this would be to use specialty news outlets, where general news outlets aren't actually that good or that helpful at teaching you new things or exposing you to things that are really useful. Unless you're trying to be I don't know, I can't think of anything that's really the general news outlet is actually good for. But if you want to learn something and become a better thinker at a couple different topics, then go and choose a few specific topics that you want to learn more about. And you can find great newsletters, you can find great websites, you can find blogs, YouTube channels, you can find books, you can find tons of stuff about learning specific topics and specific information. If you want to stay up to date on things, I would highly recommend going out and finding specialty news outlets just for that thing. Or if you want to go out and just find a bunch of random information, a recommendation that I've received that I think is really interesting is called the Browser Email Newsletter, and it's great for getting exposed to a lot of just random information and learning new things. From what I understand, the Browser Email Newsletter is basically just, here's 5 interesting things that the editor thought were kind of cool this past week, and none of them have to be related. So yeah, go out and actively diversify your media consumption to forcibly expose you to more new ideas. Next is to actively try to solve problems by drawing connections between ideas or concepts as you go throughout your day. So think about some different problems that you might have that are just kind of irritating, or things going on at work. Just sit down and think to yourself, what are my different areas of expertise? What are some interesting things from this area and this area, and can I draw connections between them? By actively trying to draw connections between different disciplines that you understand or know well about, you can build that muscle of, if I'm in a problem situation and I need to solve this problem, that you can get into that habit of connecting ideas in your head. So it's more of a passive-ish kind of way to develop interdisciplinary thinking based on knowledge you already have, but it's still a pretty good one, since by developing the muscle in your head, you're able to better use that in times of need when you actually need to solve a problem. Next would be to try and pick out some new hobbies that force you to develop an interdisciplinary thinking skill set, and go out, try new things. Just find something that you think to yourself, yeah, that seems fun, that seems different. I want to go learn how to do this thing, because not only is it going to help you develop interdisciplinary thinking, it's going to make you just a more interesting person, because people who go out and do things are interesting. I don't want to talk to the person that goes to work, goes home, makes microwave dinner, sits on the couch, watches Netflix, goes to sleep, wakes up, and repeats that day after day after day. That person is very boring to talk to. But if you talk to someone that is actively trying to do something, is actively trying to build stuff, actively learning a new skill, maybe they want to learn how to be an oil painter, or they want to learn how to do some different kind of singing, maybe they want to learn a new language, maybe you want to learn how to do Sudoku puzzles very well. I don't care what it is, but people who have hobbies or are actively trying to improve themselves are so much more interesting to talk to, just because they have something going on in their lives that isn't just work, Netflix, microwave meals, sleep, repeat. So yeah, outside of just interdisciplinary thinking, many of these hobbies will just make you a more interesting person to be around. But anyways, try to pick up new hobbies that force you to develop an interdisciplinary skill set, or just new hobbies in general that you think to yourself, yeah, maybe this skill set will be useful for other areas, but even if I'm just learning this new thing that's only relevant here, great. Because then you're still learning the skill of learning, which that can be applied anywhere. So congratulations. No matter what you do, you are learning an interdisciplinary skill set. Moving on to a sort of similar idea is to work on interdisciplinary projects and actively blend your specialties in a unique project of sorts. Let's go back to that idea of being a pianist and an engineer. Perhaps you have an idea for a new style of musical instrument where you think to yourself, I'm familiar with playing piano, and I have an engineering background. What if I were to try to blend these together in some unique project where I make some weird piano hybrid that has like other musical instruments attached to it, or maybe the keys work in a different way, or maybe it's just engineered and designed differently. By actively using these skills, by actively blending your specialties together, you're able to develop a greater sense of interdisciplinary thinking to yourself, and looking at projects that you're doing and seeing that, oh, I can connect these ideas, not just in theory, but actually in practice. Next is one that I actively try to do as much as I possibly can, and that is to talk to people in different fields and ask questions until you understand. And not just people in different fields, but people who have different belief sets, people who understand things differently from you. This is easiest to do with people who have like a different thing that they do for work that you want to go and learn more about them from it. That's easy to do. People are glad to talk about their work. Or go talk to people that have different hobbies from you. Like I said earlier, people with hobbies are far more interesting to talk to. So if you go out and find these people that have something that you don't understand or don't know about, and you go and ask them questions, try to learn more about the thing, if you keep asking questions, you're going to pick some things up about this kind of skill set or this thing that they're doing. And it's just interesting, it's fun. And then you're able to take those ideas and say, do I want to learn more about that on my own? Or maybe that I can have them try to teach me this thing. Then you can say, okay, is this a skill set that I want to learn more about? Or is this one that I can just take some cursory knowledge and then if I need it down the line, then great, I have it. If not, then fine, I just had a good conversation. So go out and actively try to talk to people in different fields and approach them with a sense of asking to understand. And like I said earlier, it's not just people who are in different fields, but people who have different ideologies, people who have different philosophies. Because interdisciplinary thinking isn't just about skills and about work and about these things that we have in our lives that are actively things that we actively do, but it's also a good way to learn about spiritual beliefs, to learn about philosophical beliefs, and maybe you, by talking to a bunch of different people about different political issues or about different philosophical or theological beliefs, you can come to a better understanding of those things yourself, and they can come to a better understanding of what they actually believe. Because, let's be honest, a lot of people don't actually know what they believe. Because I've talked to a number of people who claim to be religious in one way, shape, or form in different religions, and yet I'll ask them about certain aspects of it, and they don't know a lot about their own belief sets. So it's not only helping you, but it's helping them as well. And you can take different aspects of those philosophies, of those theologies, of different political beliefs, and say, okay, I may not agree with it, but I understand now. I understand why people believe in this and why people understand this. And it's better to make you a well-rounded person so you can communicate with different kinds of people down the line. And last, but certainly not least, is to, of course, take courses, join workshops about new topics and developing skills that you don't know much about. This is something that I try to do, or I would like to do more of. Of course, being a university, trying to graduate, not as much time as I'd like to do it, but I'm still finding some time to learn about different skills, to do some online courses. But I think a great example of this is actually going back to university general classes, where in almost every case, most students have to take a art general, where they have to go and learn about the arts in one way, shape, or form. Maybe it's singing, maybe it's oil painting, maybe it's watercoloring. I have a pretty artistic background where I'm good at sketching, I'm good at acrylic painting, good at watercoloring. So at first I was thinking to myself, yeah, I'll do a simple art class, something that I'm already used to. But then I later thought to myself, well, this is an opportunity for me to actually learn a new skill set, something that could benefit me down the line. So I was looking through the different art classes that I could do for a general, and I saw in there that an acting class was an option. Now, I have no experience acting outside of playing Dungeons & Dragons with my friends and pretending to be some elf killing dragons or whatever. So I thought to myself, this is interesting. What are some skills I could gain from this? What's a way that I can bring the ideas from acting into the real world? I can develop my skills of persuasion, of storytelling, of presenting, of being a public speaker, of improv, of coming up with things on the fly, of maybe body and presence, and developing my body language, voice projection, and trying to become more articulate. Wow, that was a great way to phrase that to show that it really did help, definitely. But coming back to this, by choosing to take an acting class, something that I was unfamiliar with and had very little experience with, I went from just being someone who could draw and paint and do this side of art to being able to act to some basic level, to be able to apply many of the skills I learned there to different areas of my life. A lot of the acting skills that I learned in that class, I've gone on to use in many presentations I've used for classes or for other cases. And I feel like I've adapted some of the articulation skills and some of the storytelling skills I learned from that class into other aspects of my life. So those are just some different ideas to help you try to develop interdisciplinary thinking. Hopefully now you see that there is a place for interdisciplinary thinking in our modern world. Perhaps it's not for everyone, but as our world develops technologically, you never know when your specialty will become obsolete. It might be time for you to pick up new skills, connect ideas, and make a change. So, what did you think of this episode? Do I have a point, or am I spouting nonsense? Let me know. And if you enjoyed this episode, share it with a friend you think will like it, or share it on social media. Either way, that'll help us so much. And with all that said, thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you all later. Ciao.